There's so much shame or there's so much anxiety around wanting to figure out or find the answer so that there's some relief. I think the other piece to think about is often when we've sat with something for so long, that shame has amped up in a way that when you're sitting in front of someone and it's externalized, suddenly they're expecting that I'm going to react in a way and they've built it up in their heads. But when they're met with empathy, suddenly it's disarming in a way.
For most of us, saying no is probably one of the biggest things for us to get through, because some of us struggle with people pleasing. We don't want to be the odd man out. We don't want to isolate from community because sometimes we think that's what no is going to do.
Rather than think about overcoming, I think it's important to think about managing and preserving. And so when we think about managing and preserving mental health in the day-to-day, what does that look like in terms of self-care practices?
Welcome to The Link, where we connect Christ to our broken world. Here on the podcast, we talk about all the important areas of life and culture, presenting Christ as the missing link that brings everything together. Join us on this journey on The Link podcast with your host, Professor X. Hey, what's up, everyone? It's your boy, Professor X, and welcome to The Link. Guys, we are about to delve into a topic that we are all passionate about in some way or another. This is something that we really care about as a generation, and it's something that our society is becoming more aware of and paying more attention to. Today, we're talking about mental health. We're going to dive into some of the aspects of, the barriers that keep us away from, really getting into our mental health. We're going to talk about shame and working through shame and just understanding more about how we can take care of ourselves and to really be the best that we can be overall. And today I have an amazing guest that is joining me on this episode. Again, this is another one of my family members. This is a beloved cousin of mine. She is trained in neuropsychology. She lives in the States. She has really spent her life devoting herself to helping people through this part of their lives. And I know that we're going to get into some really good stuff as we go through our conversation. So stay tuned all the way to the end. Without further ado, let's get right to that conversation. All right, everyone. So for the first time on the Link podcast is my cousin, TRACEE Francis. How are you?
I'm great, thanks. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. This is It's great to have you on the podcast. I feel like we've had so many family members join the podcast, but I think it's just a testament to how rich our family is with wisdom and experience. Because now we're in a season where we're talking about mental health. It's something that is very important to our generation now. And when I was thinking about who I could bring on that, has the experience, has been in that field, I thought straight to you. So,
Mhm.
first of all, thanks for saying yes. Thanks for coming on. It's definitely a pleasure to kind of pick your brain a little bit on this. Because I think one of the things that my generation could fall into is the whole self-diagnosing. So you watch like 15 reels on Instagram and all of a sudden you know what's wrong with you, like that kind of thing. But I think that if we can give it a little more care, if we can give it a little more attention, we can really start to get to the bottom of some things. But before we really dive into the meat of it, I just want to understand a little bit more about your background, right? So, like, what led you into mental health? What drove you into that sphere? You could take me anywhere you want to take me.
Sure. So I will take you from to the beginning then. I was 11 years old sitting with my babysitter. Yeah. And she had done psychology in undergrad. And as I was talking to her about the things that I wanted to do, she mentioned being a child psychologist. And I thought, what is that? That sounds so cool. And as I explored more and got into undergrad, it really just kind of opened up a whole other world to me about psychology and really wanting to dive into mental health.
That's interesting. So it was someone that you were with at 11 years old, and they
Mm.
gave you that career as an option. Like, was that something that was popular around that time? Because we're talking maybe like the 90s, 80s kind of thing. What
The
what what
90s,
timeline are we
way back in the day.
90s?
The 90s,
Okay,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
But we're talking about a time where mental health was not the thing.
No.
So I find it interesting that she brought that to you. What was going through your mind when she gave that to you?
At the time, I was thinking, "Oh, I wanna be a pediatrician," because I wanted to work with kids, and she had seen me she was my babysitter, so she'd seen me interacting with kids, and she was like, "This is just something that you enjoy, that's fun." And in my mind, I was like, "That sounds really cool." I was so little. I didn't know anything else. I thought that's so cool, but no, you're right. At that time, we really weren't talking about mental health in the same way. I think generationally, your generation's really taken mental health and really embraced it in a way that I think is helping to destigmatize mental health. We still have a ways to go, but I think it's great. But yeah, generationally, that was not something that we were talking about.
Yeah, so now as you're growing older, like you said when you got to university, things started to open up for you. So here it is at 11 years old, you're thinking about a career that at the time is like against the grain. And now as you're older, how did you find was there ever a moment, like let's say in university, where you told yourself like this is what I'm going to do? No matter what anybody says, I'm going for this.
There wasn't necessarily a moment, but what I will say, because I will say I was pretty committed from 11 into even into undergrad. I was like, "This is what I'm doing." One thing I will say that really shifted for me was my last semester of undergrad. I never thought of myself as someone who is science oriented, but I took a class called Motivation and Emotion, and it was the first time I was exposed to neuroanatomy and endocrinology, and I thought, "This is really cool and really kinda easy." And so
Okay.
I ended up deciding at that point, I was like, "Maybe I wanna do neuropsychology as a clinician." So that's where the beginning of that started for me, but the child psychology still continued, but neuropsychology was that last semester, that was the add-on.
Oh wow. Yeah, that interestingly, that reminds me of my college journey because when I did university, I did a minor in graphic design. And for me, I was one of those people that thought, pen and paper is the gospel, everything else is foolishness. But I tried it. And in trying it, that's where I found my love for marketing. And now we end up here at this podcast. So I understand that journey of you trying something and then realizing, you know what, this might be the thing for me. So where I want to go now is help us understand more about what neuropsychology is because there's so many ologies, biology, psychology, all of these ologies, and they're all different. So with this
Mhm.
particular sphere, what does that usually entail?
So great question. So neuropsychology is the merging of psychology, psychiatry, and neurology. And so as a neuropsychologist, often what will happen is someone will come into my office and they'll have a complaint like something like I'm having trouble with memory or a change in memory or problems with attention. And so as a neuropsychologist, what we have to be mindful of is that merging. We're certainly not physicians, we stay in our lane as psychologists, but we're having to constantly think about what differentially in terms of diagnostically someone might be actually experiencing. So you're listening for a whole host of things as you're talking to someone in that intake to get a sense of what's happening for them. And we get a history, a very detailed history about what's going on for someone beyond the presenting complaint, even family history, psychiatric history, medical history, and getting a sense of what their support systems look like as well. And then as a neuropsychologist, we're trained to give a battery of tests, and there's a whole host of them. So we're looking at things like attention and executive functioning. We're looking at memory. We're looking at language. We're also looking at emotional functioning, to name a few things. And as we are going through and giving someone tests, you get to see how someone performs. And you also, I think the cool thing about neuropsychology is that even when someone doesn't do very well on testing, you can also help to explore the limits of what they're able to do. And once we finish that testing, if a diagnosis is warranted, we'll give it that diagnosis, but we give someone a sense of what's going on for them cognitively in terms of strengths and challenges, and some recommendations moving forward that they can take with them beyond the assessment.
Okay. Yeah, that definitely sounds like you guys have a lot of hats. It's almost like you are sifting through, okay, is this person this way? Are they that way? Do they need this? Do they need that? So is it possible for you to give us like a potential scenario, like what could potentially happen if it were to come into your office?
Oh my gosh, I get to nerd out right now. Okay. All right. So, so if you were to come into my office, I would be asking you about what you're noticing. So, for example, if someone comes to my office and they're saying, I have wondering about problems with attention. So I would ask a series of questions, and certainly the DSM-5, which is our diagnostic statistical manual that we use for diagnoses, I have a sense of what the symptoms are just having done this work for some time. So I'll be asking questions more tailored to some of those symptoms to get a sense of some of the things that you might be experiencing, and also to get a sense of real life, what kinds of things you actually experience that impair you in some ways, keeping those symptoms in mind. And then what will end up happening is I'll give you a series of paper and pencil tests that are geared towards some of the things that you're expressing that you're having trouble with, in addition to some that I keep in my fixed battery that I do with everyone. So I'll get a sense of what's going on for you. We'll do the testing, and then you would come in about 2 weeks later, and I would sit with you, and we would go through you would get a report, we would go through the findings. And so I would be able to say to you, "Okay, so maybe you don't actually have problems with attention. Maybe you thought I've got ADHD, but maybe instead of ADHD, maybe it was actually anxiety, or maybe something else that was driving, maybe some problems with sleep that were driving some of the problems with attention, for example." And so I would be able to talk with you about what's going on, because sometimes what will happen is people have this very, to your point earlier, I've diagnosed myself. I already know what it is, but that's actually not what it is. And we're able to actually give concrete data to say, look, you actually do okay on attention executive functioning. But it's actually, if we look at your emotional functioning, or if we look at some of the other factors that are happening that you told me about in the interview, that's actually what's going on. That's contributing to some of the complaints that you're having.
Well, okay, so this that's so cool. This sounds like it's really important because it gets to the root of why some things are happening. And I know for sure that my generation is definitely one that wants to understand where are all these things coming from. And now that you've explained more about what the process is like, one of the things I want to get into now is some of the misconceptions. Like the misconceptions around mental health, like what are the things that stop us from going forward with it, especially for people of faith. Like so like for us, there is, you grow up in church, you hear about, getting deeper in your walk with God, seeking Him for guidance and healing, and all of those things are true. All of those things are important. At the same time, there's also the side of taking care of your body. That doesn't necessarily come against our faith, but there are a lot of teachings that we get that make it seem as if we go for mental health, if we get deeper in that realm, then all of a sudden it means that we're going against our faith. So for me, that's a big stigma that a lot of us have to work through. And based on what you told me so far, the depth of it is just understanding the science of what's going on in here. So the way that I look at it, if I know that attention is one of the things that I'm struggling with, I'm going to take that to the Lord in prayer. At the same time, I'm doing all of these exercises that I may need to do, whatever you may recommend to me. So for me, mental health and getting help in mental health helps us to be even more accurate in our faith, in my opinion, because now you know exactly what to bring to God. That's my thing when it comes to that particular misconception that makes faith and science incongruent.
Right.
Anything to say on that?
Sure. So yeah, so I think to your point, yeah, I think there are contributing factors as to why someone might struggle with like looking at mental health as a factor. And I think to your point, I think it reminds me of one of the stigmas that I think about is that mental health is a sign of weakness if we lean into that. And I think there's so many contributing factors as to why that might be the case, whether it is our spiritual journey, whether it is things like how we talk about in our family culture, mental health. Sometimes race and ethnicity can factor into whether or not that contributing factor, whether or not we seek mental health, because we know there's a disparity in terms of folks that seek mental health if we're talking about race and ethnicity. And even just how we talk about mental health in our families, whether it's accepted or not, whether it's talked about as a sign of weakness, whether it's encouraged. And society at large, I know we alluded to it earlier, culturally, we're still working on doing a better job, I think, when we talk about media. And I think generationally, you all are doing a better job than we certainly did and trying to shine light on mental health and making sure that we're being really responsible about that too, with what we're consuming social media wise.
I mean, yeah, so yes, my generation is now starting to push some of those boundaries. But we touched on it earlier. One of the dangers with us is that we are constantly going to these outside sources, so social media. So because we have so much information at our fingertips, we can follow all of the gurus on Instagram. We can look at the latest trends. We can even use AI. If we put enough information in there, we can ask it to literally diagnose us based on what we said. But then there's the stigma there that we can figure it out on our own because of technology. But then we end up losing the human touch. We end up losing the care that all of you guys go through and the knowledge that you guys have. So yes, we have all the knowledge at our fingertips, but that doesn't necessarily mean we know where to look. And
That's fair.
it's also one of those things where we can have the same exact information. I get the information, you get the information. But my interpretation is one thing and your interpretation is completely different. So I think the trap that we tend to fall in is this seek for knowledge and thinking that we can do it on our own instead of seeking help. So we know we need it, but like you said before, reaching out is a sign of weakness. So in order to avoid that, I'm gonna do my own private stuff. I'm gonna figure this out on my own. But then there's so many dangers of going into situations where you almost force yourself into a problem or you misdiagnose yourself, and because you believe it, you start to show the symptoms. All of that stuff can start to happen.
Yeah, and I think to be fair, I think there is a seeking of knowledge in some ways. I think some of it's stigma related, but I think some of it's also there's so much shame or there's so much anxiety around wanting to figure out or find the answer so that there's some relief. And I think the challenging thing is that in the process of what you're sifting through, to your point, you don't necessarily have the interpretation that someone who's been trained has. And so it can lead people down a rabbit hole that ends up potentially contributing to contributing to some of the challenges they're having, but also contributing to some of the stigma as well that they might have internalized.
Hey guys, I hope you're enjoying the podcast so far. Just popping in to say that if you haven't already, make sure to like this episode and also subscribe to stay updated with all of the content that is coming your way. Join me on the journey of finding the missing link. Peace.
So now, if you have someone that comes into your office and you realize that they struggle with these things, is there how have you found that process of helping them work through that? Because obviously it took courage for them to come to you in the first place. So now how do we get from working through those stigmas and through those barriers to be open to the help that we need?
Well, I think this is the place where I really want to be getting a very detailed history with someone to get a sense, and I really think it's important to factor in someone's culture, whether it's family culture, whether it's race and ethnicity, to get a sense of how they've internalized that and how much that might actually be impacting how they show up in therapy. I think the other piece to think about is often when we've sat with something for so long, that shame has amped up in a way that when you're sitting in front of someone and it's externalized, suddenly they're expecting that I'm going to react in a way and they've built it up in their heads. But when they're met with empathy, suddenly it's disarming in a way that then it allows possibly for the beginning of them to also have empathy for themselves. Brene Brown, who talks about she's out there talking, quite a bit about shame. She's a shame researcher, and she talks about how shame can't live in a space of empathy, and I think that's one of those places where therapy can be helpful because someone is met with empathy, and then maybe there's a little bit more space for them, as I said, to have empathy for themselves.
That's big. That is so big. And it is something that we can sometimes miss in the church. There are people who have shown us so much empathy, and listen, I have such a long list of those people, but there's also these situations where some of these situations aren't handled well. So we may get
Mhm.
a response that feels as if we're being brushed off, or a response that makes it trivialize some of the stuff that we're going through. So when we hear someone that validates what we have gone through and validates the journey that we're on, that can make all the difference.
Yeah, yeah. That it's not minimized, right? That there is this sense of what you're experiencing is valid, and it's okay to talk about it.
Exactly. So know that we're understanding that there's a process we can go through. Kind of walk me through what it's like once you've figured out like what's the root of something, especially if you realize that it's shame. How do we start to work through that part?
So I think a few things, just managing expectations walking into therapy, because I think sometimes people think, "Oh, I'm gonna come in and the therapist is gonna immediately know what's going on with me," but it takes us some time to not only get a sense of what's going on with someone, but also to build that therapeutic rapport that someone actually trusts you enough to share some of these challenges that they're having. So sometimes people will come in and they'll just kind of be like, "Here's all the stuff, now fix it." And really some of the work is about managing expectations around what the process is gonna be like. It's not gonna be immediate, that we're gonna work through it together, that there are gonna be so many layers. There's so many layers to unpack with folks. And sometimes I'll work with someone for years and we're still unpacking or we're still kind of pulling apart what's actually happening. And so, yeah, so if someone's coming in and they're at the root of it is shame, it takes a bit of time to get there with someone because there's so many defenses around it. There's so many protective factors that we can hold when we have shame. And Brene Brown also talks about shame shields. Sometimes when we have shame, we really retreat. Sometimes we get defensive around it. And so some of what I end up having to do if someone's coming into my office and there's a lot of shame is to really be able to sit with them and to develop that therapeutic alliance, that relationship that then allows them to be comfortable enough to talk about what's going on for them.
I'm hearing you talk about that, and I'm thinking the church can really benefit from this approach. Like in terms of just sitting with someone. I think sometimes, when people come to us with problems, we have a heart to help. We have a heart to help them get through. And I think sometimes that can put us in a spot where we're always trying to give an answer where there might not be an answer yet. Sometimes it might just be sitting with them, uh, showing that we understand the pain, showing that we understand, but regardless of it, we are here. That's what I'm getting when you tell me about helping someone through that shame, letting them know that someone is here and being there long enough to show that you're trustworthy so they can start to open up and let down those defenses. So
Yes, and I think
that was golden.
great, great. And I think the other thing just that I'll add to that is that I think sometimes you mentioned the church, sometimes people have they're coming from good intentions. There's no malintent. They want to fix. But I think, as we were talking about, sometimes sitting with the discomfort, it's not about fixing. Sometimes it's about sitting in the discomfort with someone and being okay and showing them that it's okay to sit with them in it. This reminds me of the example. I remember when I was in training, one of my professors said this. She said, if you go to a playground and you watch parents and you watch, everyone wants to take care of their kids. They want their kids to be okay, but you see the kid that falls and the kid's looking for the parent's reaction. And if the parent is like, "Ah," and they're like, you're okay," that's about someone wanting to help, but they're more uncomfortable in the process. They're anxious, and so in the process, the kid's reacting to that as opposed to, "Are you okay?" That's saying to someone, "Whatever it is, whatever you're feeling, we can sit with this together." And it's not about fixing, it's about sitting with.
Oh my gosh. That is a part of me doesn't know what to say next because that is so powerful by itself. Um, that is something that if you can really get that as peers to each other, as friends, as brothers, sisters, I think that would change a lot. Because a lot of what happens to us when we deal with mental health is that feeling that we're alone, that there's no one that's gonna understand. And like you said, you start to build this mental prison. So if you can't carry it to the ones you love, you can't carry it to God, anyone. So that's so powerful what you talked about. Anything else on that point?
I think the one thing I would add just broadly when we're talking about stigma and mental health is that whether we acknowledge our mental health or not, it is a part of all of us. And I will include myself in there as well. And what I mean by that is, yes, there are some people that diagnostically, they have a diagnosis that impacts them functionally in the day to day. And also, whether we acknowledge our mental health collectively as human beings, we all have it. And so when we think about mental health, think about our well-being in terms of how we're thinking, how we're feeling, how we're behaving. That is something that whether we acknowledge it or not, it's part of us, like our physical health, and it's important to attend to because of that.
And I'm actually glad you touched on that because I think something else we have to consider is that therapists have also been through a lot. Some every once in a while I can hear stories of, one of the reasons people don't go is they think that the therapist hasn't been through much, so they can't understand. They don't know what I've been through. Not understanding that, first of all, you guys have like an oath that you guys swear to for confidentiality. You can't share certain things about your personal life because you have to keep things professional. So the person sitting across from you doesn't know that, for all they know, you've been through the same thing or you've had to do the same things to work on yourself. So what has your mental health journey been like, if you can touch on that?
Sure. So, as I alluded to, I think in terms of mental health, it's part of all of us. And so, again, I include myself in there. So, in the process of thinking about mental health, I think about my mental health every day in terms of my well being, in terms of how I'm thinking, how I'm feeling, how I'm behaving. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like in terms of practice for me in a moment. But to your just wanting to go back to something you said, I think that is something what you touched upon in terms of people thinking, "Well, they're not gonna understand. I'm on my own here." They haven't necessarily had the same experience, or maybe they haven't had any negative experiences at all. The irony is a lot of people go into this field because 'cause they're wanting to understand something that's gone on with them. So that's one thing. The other piece is that yes, that can be its own slippery slope if you're
I
not
did not
careful.
know that.
Yes, yes. But the other piece though too in training is that you become very aware of what your stuff is if you do it well, if you do the training well. So that you're not bringing because we all have stuff, all of us. And so making sure that when as therapists when we're walking into a room with someone that we're ensuring that our stuff isn't negatively impacting someone else in the process of sitting with them. So that's one thing in terms of awareness that you really want to be mindful as a therapist because we're human too. I think the other piece is, nope, I'm not gonna have everyone's experiences, but being able to sit with someone and ask questions and not be arrogant enough to assume that I know what's going on, especially if I haven't had that experience. I ask a lot of questions to try to understand what's happening with someone. So with my own mental health, I think one place in my life where it became really apparent that it's so important to take care of mental health, ironically, was when I was in training. Toward the end of my training, I was in postdoc. It was back in 2014. I lost my dad very unexpectedly. And in the midst of that, I was finishing a very competitive, very busy postdoc where I was working 40 plus, 50 plus hours a week. I was studying for a licensure exam to be a psychologist. I was looking for a job. And then my dad passed away. And all of that was already stressful in itself. And that was like you need to slow down moment, and really realizing you cannot, regardless of how much you might want to, you cannot white knuckle it through grief. You've got to, I always say to my clients, we try to white knuckle it through things, and sometimes we just have to allow for it to be and recognize like what we're doing, and just allow it to sit and allow us to be in that discomfort, because we can't muscle through things when they're hard. I think grief is one of those areas that, and this is something that I noticed when I was in the midst of, like, just after my dad passed away, you're going through all these cultural customs, like going through a celebration of life, going through a funeral, and then you realize that people fade away and there's no malintent. All these people have wrapped around initially, but they go back to their lives, and we've all done it in those moments. But I think when you're the person that's grieving, it can feel really isolating. And so really making sure that you lean into those supports, really making sure that you're aware of what's going on for you, that you're leaning into the community that you have. And so one of the things that I do for my own mental health is making sure that I surround myself with a good, solid community of people, whether that's professionally, whether that's personally. I have an awesome gym community that I'm part of as well. So making sure that community is a big part of mental health in terms of that connection. The other thing that I do is that I cannot take credit for this, but I use a mindset acronym. I learned this from a psychologist that I know in New York. And so what the purpose of a mindset acronym is to come up with, I would say, 3 to 4 things that are personalized to you, that help you to ground yourself, help you to show up in an optimal way in your day-to-day of whatever that's gonna look like, whatever you need to do in your day. So for me, mine is Muse. I meditate, I exercise, I write, and I sing every day. And that's something that I do every day for my own mental health, because it's about pouring into myself so that I can go out into the world and show up in the best possible way that I can.
That is such great information. I'm definitely, it's funny, right? I remember we had a conversation about this before, like the acronym for every day. And I think, if I can remember correctly, I think mine was Dream. Yes, it was
Mhm.
Dream. I
Right.
have to remember exactly what it was, but all of those are really important for us to really have community, for us to pay attention to our mental health on the day to day. There is one more thing that I really want to explore, because you touched on it a couple of times. Sitting in it, like when we're going through grief, when we're going through pain, allowing ourselves to sit in it. That's probably one of the most counterintuitive ideas. Like, it doesn't matter which background you come from. I can speak for the Caribbean. Like, here in the Caribbean, we have a very, go after it kind of mentality, or it's either that or it is a go with the flow. But for most of us, sitting in discomfort, sitting in grief, that's not our first instinct. So a lot of times it's difficult to see the benefit of allowing the sadness to sit there for a while. Or if someone has passed away, like letting that grief kind of settle. So the question I would have for you is, like, what's the benefit of letting it sit there? And what's the difference between feeling it and wallowing in it?
That's a great question. So first, I would say that if we try to, sitting in it is terrible. It doesn't feel great. for anyone, right? It's uncomfortable. No one wants to sit in it. And so that's fair. So as human beings, we're trying to kind of look for the thing that's going to fix it, that's going to get us away from the discomfort. But the challenging thing is that it's there whether we acknowledge it or not. And so in the sitting in it is acknowledging it, is acknowledging that it's there, is accepting that it's there because it's there whether or not we acknowledge it or not. And sometimes in my experience as a psychologist, if we don't learn to sit in it, if we don't learn to acknowledge and accept it, it comes out in other ways, whether it's a panic attack or whether it's significant depression, it comes out in other ways. So learning to get comfortable with the discomfort of how uncomfortable it is really important because it's there anyhow, whether we address it or not, it's there. And I think sometimes this might sound counterintuitive, but I think sometimes in the process of trying to push it away, we actually can sometimes prolong it for ourselves when we don't actually address it. So there's that piece. Yes, yes, yeah, yeah. There's that piece. And I'm trying to think about, you asked me a second part, and I'm trying to remember what that was, to be honest, Xavier, at this point.
Oh, no, I can repeat it. I was asking, like, so the difference between letting it sit,
Sitting and walking.
feeling it, and wallowing. Yeah.
Mhm. Yes. So thank you for repeating that. So I think wallowing, when we think about sitting with it, I think being able to, I think there's when I think about wallowing, I'm hesitating because I don't know, wallow is not probably the word I would use. Sitting, so whether when we're sitting in it versus when it feels like it's consuming and overwhelming to the point where we're having a hard time functioning. Let's phrase it that way.
Okay.
So I think in that context, being able to acknowledge, okay, so I can sit with it, but also give myself the permission to kind of to put it on a shelf. Sometimes I'll say to people, all right, so when we put it on a shelf, we're still acknowledging that it's there. We're not ignoring it. We're not avoiding it. But sometimes be able to address, like, I'm not in the space right now to have the bandwidth to really address this. So I'm gonna put it to the side right now, acknowledging that it's still there to be able to take it back off when I'm off the shelf, when I actually have the space and the bandwidth to sit with it a little bit more. And sometimes that means someone might be like, all right, in the process of this, I can sit with my therapist, I can sit with you around it. And then sometimes when I'm outside of this space, it might not feel safe to do to explore. And I don't mean safe in terms of physical safety, in terms of emotionally safe. So until we get to a point where someone's feeling a little bit more grounded or a little bit more stabilized, maybe we allow for the space of therapy to be the place that we explore this more.
Yeah. That sounds good. That's definitely something that I hope we catch. That it's okay to feel it, but then it's also okay to put boundaries on it if we need to. Because especially for people like me who are deep thinkers, deep feelers, it really
Mhm.
doesn't take much for that feeling of being overwhelmed or consumed. So it's good to know that we can feel it, yes, but then we can also uh give ourselves that break before coming into it again. So that's a huge thing. And first of all, I think we have covered a lot. We have really delved into, some of the things that stop us from engaging in mental health and kind of gotten deeper in understanding shame and how we can work through that. Is there anything else that you would give to us as advice when we think about mental health before we close off?
Sure. So I think I know before we had gotten into the podcast as well, we talked a little bit about like this concept of overcoming mental health. And I think that that can be something that's challenging for folks when we think about overcoming. Rather than think about overcoming, I think it's important to think about managing and preserving. And so when we think about managing and preserving mental health in the day to day, what does that look like in terms of self-care practices? And so I think when we think about self-care, we wanna think about our physical well-being, our emotional well-being, and our social well-being. So we touched on community earlier in terms of social. I think you mentioned boundaries. I think that's also a good thing to acknowledge when we're thinking about social, really getting good at establishing good boundaries. And I think I always say to people, saying no is a skill that a lot of us don't actually
Oh
get,
yeah.
and that's a big part of boundaries. You look like you wanna say something and yeah, yeah.
No, I'm just saying, like, no is probably one of the most difficult words for us to get comfortable with. For some people it seems like it's their profession. But for most of us, saying no is probably one of the biggest things for us to get through, because some of us struggle with people pleasing. We don't want to be the odd man out. We don't want to isolate from community, because sometimes we think that's what no is going to do. We think no is going to shut us off from everything else. We think no is going to drive people further away. And so it can seem like the last response we should have, when not realizing that taking that word out of our vocabulary only harms our own well being.
Yes, we worry about that loss of rejection, that loss of love, the loss of missed opportunity in the process of the no. But what we don't recognize is how much we're impacting ourselves negatively when we don't say the no. And that setting boundaries, if someone has a strong reaction to that no, it's actually not about us. It's about them not getting what they're anticipating. And someone that cares about you can hear the no and sit with it, even if they're uncomfortable, even if they're disappointed. And that's the thing to take away from that, that setting boundaries is important to do. The other thing, so going back to, that's the social well-being. I think in terms of physical well-being, being mindful about things like sleep hygiene, which I can tell you a little bit more about what that means if that feels like a useful use of our time as well.
Oh yeah, you can delve straight in a little bit. You can delve straight in a
Okay,
bit.
sure. Okay, I wasn't sure how much time we had, so I wanted to be respectful of it. So sleep hygiene is the routine that we get into that cues our body that we're getting ready for sleep. So when we think about sleep hygiene, we think about our personal habits and our environment. So personal habits being the things that help us to kind of power down for the day. So turning off those screens. We don't want that blue light to get ourselves into that fight or flight space that ends up happening with that blue light. So turning off those screens, whether it's doing things like skincare, that's my jam. Skincare before I go to bed with that aroma, whether it's being able to drink some tea, or whether it's to be able to sit and read for a little bit, something that's a personal habit that's gonna slow you down to cue your body it's time for bed. Environmentally, we wanna be mindful about things like the temperature of the room that we're in, making sure it's between 60 to 70 degrees Fahrenheit, that it's a well-ventilated space, that if we're sensitive to light, that we've got, like, a dark space. Things that environmentally are gonna give you the best chance of having a restful sleep.
Listen, first of all, I am going to, when this video comes out, I'm going to take notes, because I know for sure I need to work on my sleep hygiene. You've given us a lot today. You have helped us understand how to work through more of these things surrounding mental health, and appreciate what you brought, because I think what's going to happen as we start to internalize this is that mental health will no longer be this big thing over our heads, but we can start to integrate it into how we move on a day-to-day basis. So I just want to thank you a lot for coming on here and sharing about what you're so passionate about, because it's something that is really on the hearts and minds of people in my generation. And I just want to help us understand how to go about it. So we know how to link the community. We know how to help others that are also struggling with mental health. And we can all just be better and more unified as people. So I just want to thank you again for coming on. It was a pleasure for sure.
Thank you for having me. It was my absolute pleasure to do this, and I love you, and I'm happy to always help in any way I can.
Much appreciated, cuz. All right, guys. So this brings us to the end of the episode. Stay tuned to the next episode of The Link. But until then, stay blessed and God bless you. Peace.